So Francisco Franco banning evolution, or the teaching of evolution, right? His attempt at changing a narrative, or capturing a narrative, or dominating a narrative. Um, Dictators at the time used that tactic back then. Just ban stuff, ban books. Stalin banned books all the time. Hitler banned books all the time. But perhaps today you can't get away with that. So one of the ways to change a narrative, or dominate a narrative, or manipulate a narrative is what's called the Firehose of Falsehoods. Alex, do you want to give us a little rundown of what the Firehose, excuse me, not Firehood, Firehose of Falsehoods are?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny. It's probably one of the hardest words for me to say lately. I've been like firehouse, fire hose, fire hood of
Right.
yeah, yeah. It's just a struggle to say, but anyways, yeah. I mean, it's actually a super fascinating concept, which I think the Cato Institute were the first ones to really like at least coin the term. But it's something that's been around for a long time. But it's also been something that I think the Soviet and the post-Soviet era Russians have been really good at, and it's basically flooding the system with a bunch of bullshit, misinformation, half truths, truths sometimes, and just propaganda. So basically, you're just putting so many things into the system and into the public that no one knows what to believe anymore. It's also like contradictory information. Like one day you say one thing, and the next day you speak against what you said the day previous. And it just causes confusion. So a population becomes cynical and just gives up and just kind of goes into their corners. And I think the best example of it with Putin was when, let's see, I have the name, Sergei Skripal. I'm probably butchering his name, sorry, but when he was killed with his daughter in Britain in 2018 with that nerve agent, that lovely radiation nerve agent that sounds not too great, and the Kremlin basically responded by saying it was Britain or Ukraine, and or it was an accident, and or it was a suicide, and or it was a revenge killing, and or Russia did not do it, and or maybe Russia did. And obviously on their own, you're like, obviously Russia's just like bullshitting through this because they're obviously guilty. But if you're a population who, for whatever your reasons, are doing other things in your life, you're just getting information and hoping it's correct. And I think over time, you just lose faith. And I've seen Republicans in the U.S., unfortunately, have started adopting that. Steve Bannon, I think, brought it over. I mean, he's been on world tours. He's been basically on the fascist world tour for the last, like, decade. And he basically said prior to Trump's election in 2016, he said that our goal is just to flood the system with misinformation. And it's working, man. Because, I mean, we've seen since Trump, I mean, he has done it better than Putin could have ever dreamed. I mean, Trump was already a bullshit artist. That was kind of how he's done so well in real estate, The Apprentice, whatever. And he parroted this Kremlin disinformation better than anyone could have.
Yeah, this article, and also by Jonathan Rauch, and then also his conversation with Billy Crystal that you and I both listened to. Again, Billy Crystal and Jonathan Rauch are like neoconservatives, right? These guys are Republicans through and through. These are not like Nancy Pelosi, Yas Queen, progressive liberals. These are conservatives, and they are justifiably very worried about this fire hose of falsehood. And I think you said it well. This is a tactic. Jonathan Rauch explains this as well. That this is a tactic used by despots, authoritative leaders, right? Those looking to maintain power and manipulate narratives. This is a tactic used by them all the time, and it is that idea that, okay, if you can't you're not the despot of old that literally owns the printing press and can just like kill a journalist. So instead, you flood the waves with so much information because we live in an information age and everyone's connected to social media. You just flood it with different stuff that people almost roll their eyes and don't care anymore. Like it's almost like um yeah, it's like such a deflection. Like I don't know, it's almost like catching a kid. Like it's almost like catching a kid with their hand in the cookie jar, and then they just start listing off 13 different excuses. Like, "Whoa, my blood sugar was low, and I was gonna get late. I needed a breakfast, and all this stuff." And you're almost just like, oh, "Fine, whatever." Like it's just so much that, and like, that's the thing. It's like fatigue on top of just confusion. And I think that Trump has mastered both, and Jonathan Rauch also believes he's mastered both. That where he can really, he can push narratives so far, like the idea that Joe Biden, a again, that like a pretty centrist left candidate, uh, that is pretty milk toast and by the book American politician, was able to squeak out an election against a unlikable president, that is somehow less likely than what Trump is saying, that it was the largest orchestrated and most well orchestrated election fraud in American history that not only turned the tides of multiple states, but was able to be done so in a way that was not caught by court systems. Like, and 60 to 70% of Republicans believe that. And so, and if you look, what you're talking about is, you look at the evidence. When Trump talks about these theories about what's going on in Arizona, he never says anything definitively. He says people come up to me and say things, and people say we should take a look at this, and I think we should take a look at that. And it's like, no, man, you have to say, you have to make a claim and provide evidence for that. But he's very sly in the way that he throws out all these different exclamations and, hey, I don't know, I'm just saying people should look at these things. And it is a fire hose of falsehood. I wanted to bring up a historical example, that I think could be maybe interesting to look at, maybe with like a modern context. So, in Russia, in the Soviet Stalin era, there was that famine in Ukraine, and because there was so little infrastructure and there's not nearly the media apparatus we have today, it took a couple years for the famine in Ukraine to become news. Millions of people dying as a famine as a result of Stalin's policies for his agrarian change. And it wasn't until, but some stories started to get leaked out after a few years, and Stalin wanted to get ahead of the narrative, so he found a New York Times reporter in Moscow that was a drunk, and he had a lot of affairs, so he was easily blackmailable, and he sent him to Ukraine, and basically, and instead of saying everything is fine, he just said, well, there's some hungry people, and yeah, there's some supply shortages in some towns, but no, there's no famine, and millions of people aren't dead, and it was just a couple hungry people. I mean, everyone has problems, and that was basically his report. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for that from the New York Times.
What?
Yes, a Pulitzer Prize in the 30s for that. This reporter, for his investigative journalism in Ukraine, and it was enough to keep people off of the back, because it was, even though there was other reports saying no, we're getting reports that millions of people are literally dying. He had one that was said, it's not as bad as you think. It's kind of okay. There's just some people hungry, and it just muddied the waters. Now imagine if, again, because there was limited amount of reporting that could even happen because of the technological and infrastructure limitations. But imagine if Stalin also had reporters put out things like, the famine's happening because of a locust infestation. No, the famine's happening because the Black Sea has an algae bloom. No. There's no famine at all. It's a lie from Bosnian terrorists just flooding it out. Again, like, you wouldn't know. Like, that's what he did. He tried to control the narrative in his way, and now we're seeing the control the narrative in the other way, which is just keep flooding it, even if the narratives are false, even if they don't even make you look that good, if they make you look medium in the middle, it's enough to just confuse people. So it worked on a small scale in Ukraine back in the 30s, and now it's working on a larger scale with social media from Trump.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think the big issue is that basically it takes the burden of proof away from the person who's saying it, and it puts it on the consumer. And I feel that so many times when I talk with relatives or friends who voted for Trump, and obviously I have some friends that voted for Trump who now are like, maybe he wasn't such a good idea. But I have other ones that have doubled down, and I've tried to just be like, I haven't seen any evidence that it was a fraudulent election enough to turn it from Trump to Biden.
Yeah.
And they basically say, well, so-and-so said this, and like, well, there's been these like waves out of here. And it's just like they flood me personally when I talk to them with information where I just walk away saying, I'm not going to convince you. And I just put that on a macro level. I'm like, fuck, man, excuse my language, but like, this country is screwed if our like shared sense of reality is gone. And that's what's happening. Like, it terrifies me. And it's great you use that Ukraine famine one, because That was also one of my examples. Was not even that part of it, which I didn't even know that a reporter got a Pulitzer Prize for that, which is
Yeah,
horrendous in
crazy.
so
A New
many
York
ways.
Times reporter from Moscow. Yeah,
But like, I mean, I've heard reports where like parents would eat their own kids because they were worried their neighbors would eat their kids.
right.
So like, it was like eat your kids first. But basically, like, yeah, Lenin. This is even before Stalin. Like when Lenin first realized that Ukraine could be a breadbasket for their, collectivist, send it all to Moscow approach to like dealing with like resources. He just sent in this czar, as he called him, like this Ukrainian czar. He was like a Ukrainian-born guy who worked for the Bolshevik regime in Moscow, and he went there and just decided he would use class division against the people, so he didn't actually have to use force from Moscow. And basically, they just created like a contradictory class system where it was like poor farmers against poorer farmers. It was like, okay, maybe if you own land, you're considered rich according to the Russians, but if you're working on that land, you're considered super poor. And they kind of allowed the Ukrainian farmers to eat each other, to basically just go against each other, and then the Bolsheviks just used the peasants to take all the
All right.
resources into Moscow. And it was like basically just so many contradicting things that it just worked. And it's just really too bad. And I mean, like put that into 2020, COVID-19. I mean, I think like the pandemic should have never been the way it was in the US. I think there was a time where we all wanted to come together, and for a small moment I thought it would happen. But the problem is like human beings, the CDC made some errors early on. Fauci said don't buy masks when it was clear he was just trying to save the masks for the people who needed them. I'm not a big Fauci guy, to be honest, but like I don't think he's some devil. And unfortunately, like just a few mess ups by COVID officials and public health experts basically turned the issue into propaganda on the right versus experts, and it became populism versus science almost.
Yeah.
And that was all led by Fox News and Newsmax and OAN, where they basically said like, see, you don't know. Like it's not like you need to prove yourself, it's just, do you know that's correct? And it's really sad because I think our country is worse since COVID. We're more divided, and we lost way too many people, and it just didn't have to happen. And I think that was the fire hose of falsehood actually hitting home for a lot of Americans, even if they don't know what it is.
I think that there's a reason he's doing this, right? We have to identify like, okay, like the tactic is the fire hose of falsehood. There's a reason it happens, and Jonathan Rauch talked about in his conversation with Billy Crystal that like it is a deliberate tactic, right? So like we should not treat it as like, oh, Trump's a bumbling idiot who just didn't know that bleach didn't work, and he just didn't know that masks worked or whatever. He just, oh, I don't know, and we just have to, well, he didn't know. What are you gonna do? Like, no, he knew. He deliberately wanted to confuse people. And I watched a great documentary about how to become a tyrant on Netflix, narrated by Peter Dinklage. It's a little goofy, but it's pretty good, and it goes into how tyrants take power. And one of it is sowing distrust, how using distrust. From distrust from people from the other, distrust of the public, distrust of government, which we talked about in your schism. Distrust can be used for political gain all the time. Stalin did that again. Back to Stalin, is he called the Great Terror between 1936 and 1938, where 750,000 Russians turned in their neighbors because they thought they were trying to overthrow the state, and everyone was scared of everyone else because at any moment you could just point the finger and be like, I think he's trying to overthrow Stalin, and they take them in a van and you're gone, right? So while we don't have that, that's not the kind of distrust we have today. I'm not worried about people pointing at me and sending me to a gulag. The kind of distrust is that who's vaccinated, what media can I trust, who's part of the deep state, right? Who rigged my election? I mean, people have literally thought that I've been paid to protest. Like, I mean, I think that whole idea of every protest you see on TV must have a paid actor, right? BLM protest, paid actor, crisis actors at school shootings, right? That sense of distrust makes it so that people are vulnerable and look to strong men. They look to authoritative figures to quell the chaos. Again, quote verbatim from Trump, I alone can fix this country. He said that many times in his campaigning. Is this I alone? Who else but me? What do you have to lose? I am your savior. And that is behavior that is can be compared to Francisco Franco, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Ida something in Uganda. All of these leaders that use these exact tactics, and the Firehose of Falsehood is the most modern one, used by Trump, used by, I would arguably say, used by North Korea. They give their citizens a plethora of weird information all the time. They make up stories all the time, keep them confused and out of the know. Putin utilizes this probably the best. To keep what is supposed to be considered a modern democracy, a faux democracy, basically a shadow of the Soviet Union in operation. So yeah, it's and again, I don't know, I can't get out of my head how important it is to realize that this is not a mistake, but an active, deliberate strategy used against the American people by at the time its own president and now a past president.
Absolutely. And just the last thing I'll add, at least on this part here, is that I think you are so correct. And I think one of the issues that mainstream media had at the beginning of Trump's rise to presidency was that they assumed he was an idiot. And they're slowly catching on to it. And I'm glad Republicans like
Yeah.
myself and some of the Bill Kristols and the Bulwark, they're talking about it, because the thing is that Trump reads a room better than almost anybody. Trump knows exactly what he's doing. Yeah, he talks weird. He ain't good with that, describing things thing. But he he knows exactly what he's doing, and it worked. And what terrifies me the most is this Arizona audit. I don't even want to call it that because it's such bullshit. It started with bamboo ballots, then Italy Gate, which is Italian lasers hijacked the election, and now it's a company that actually is GOP aligned is now actually running these audits. To me, it's not about the election. It's not about actually fighting fraud. It's about confusing people, and it's a dress rehearsal for 2022 and 2024. So I think people need to be ready.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, and you mentioned some great people in that list of ones who have used this before, but there's one you didn't mention, and I think it's a good segue into our next segment, is Jair Bolsonaro.
That's right.
You were the one who kind of first shared me this. So, what do you think about Jair Bolsonaro, who is the current leader of Brazil?
Right. So why we bring this up coming out of this is Jair or whatever his name is, Bolsonaro, is in a new world of trouble. So Brazil has been hit very hard with COVID. In fact, most of the COVID deaths around the world only come from three countries: India, the United States, and Brazil. And so, you're into hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of cases of COVID in Brazil. And it's now at the point where the country is at economic turmoil. Inflation rates around the world are high, right, and prices are high around the world. And on top of that, Brazil is losing out to the dollar, right? If the dollar itself is in trouble, a lot of these other countries' economies are in even more trouble. Brazil is no different. And so Brazil is in a tricky situation, and Bolsonaro's position is now a lot trickier as well. So for a long time, for the last year, Bolsonaro has been downplaying the coronavirus, said things like it's a little flu. I'm not going to get it. If I get it, I'll just cough it out because I'm so tough, right? He's played a tough guy. Don't worry about it. It's just a little flu. Brazil's stronger than this. Well, Brazil gets ravaged by COVID. He's already unpopular because of that. Now that we're in the vaccination stage of the pandemic, Brazil is very behind and trying to catch up. So they're doing deals around vaccines. Well, it's come to light that Bolsonaro and a few of his administrative buddies in the government have, I think, grifting profits off the top of vaccination deals with India, and so there's now allegations of corruption among Bolsonaro and his government around the purchase of vaccinations. And so when you have that combination of you played it off as no big deal, and we all got COVID, and it's really freaking bad, and our country's in a really bad spot. And now, in the attempt to help us, you're also grifting profit off of a vaccination deal. It's led him to be, let's see where it is here. A majority of Brazilians support impeaching him. So that's kind of what happens when
Lovely.
you mess around, you get hit. All right, so he's messed around and he's getting hit. So what that means is the Supreme Court system in Brazil is now opening up investigations of this allegation. So he's actually going to be investigated for these, and it's turning into real stuff, real action happening in the government to look into what's going on. He has an election coming up, and his polls are awful. He used to have a majority support a few years ago, and now he's looking at 20 to 30%, which is abysmal if you're talking about winning an election. And so now he still has a lot of friends inside the government. He has a very strong, I think, coalition of actual officials in the parliament system, but he's in dire straits. And why we're talking about him in regards to the falsehood of false information is because he utilizes that idea somewhat to his own gain. Again, he downplayed the coronavirus, but now that he's in political strife, he is now saying things that, like the upcoming election, in which he's not polling very well, is going to be fraudulent already. He's saying it's going to be fraudulent, and there's an attempt at to take away the legitimacy of Brazilian elections. And again, it's it's a playbook we're seeing throughout the world, that these authoritative strongmen will only use democracy up until it's convenient, and then as soon as democracy is not convenient, they go to the falsehoods. They use that fire hose to confuse people and just see if they can get away with calling an election fraud. And again, you have to have evidence for these claims. So if there's evidence for these claims, I will gladly shut up. But I don't think there is. What I think it is he's scared, and he's using a tactic that he's seen work in places like Belarus and Russia, and almost work in the United States, and he's going to try and copy it.
Yeah, I mean, great, like a lot there. So first off is I think part of the playbook of this is not that you have to prove that there's enough fraud. It's just if there's any crumb of fraud, then it validates your message.
Yes.
I mean that's kind of at least what Trump and them are doing in Arizona right now. And I'm assuming that's what Bolsonaro hopes is so if you can catch one guy who maybe was putting in a second ballot, then it just validates the whole story.
Yep.
But let's just go through a few quotes of what Bolsonaro said over the years.
Sure.
One here, when he was a congressman. Let's go straight to the dictatorship. Democracy doesn't work. Another one when he was also in Congress, which he served 7 terms, by the way. Elections won't change anything in this country. Unfortunately, it would only change the day that we break out in civil war and do the job that the military regime didn't do. If some innocent people die, that's fine. In every war, innocent people die. I will even be happy if I die as long as 30,000 go. And this is a guy, we were talking about how Putin is kind of the poster child of this fire hose. Again, I can't say that word for my life. Firehose of Falsehood. Bolsonaro's like Putin. These are two guys who grew up in a system that is long gone.
Yeah.
And what I mean is that Bolsonaro, he hates democracy. Let's be completely honest with that and completely frank. Is that he grew up in a rural part of Brazil when Brazil was run by a military dictatorship. And his family, I'm assuming his family were loyalists because he was a loyalist, and that's upbringing stuff. But anyways, the military sent in the military because, the military is running it and sending people, so that's always lovely. But they sent in troops to his village looking for guerrilla warfare units that were against the government and like democracy. And Bolsonaro, as a teenager, actually helped find these guerrilla warriors. He would actually help the military find people that were against dictatorship. And then he joined the military eventually, and from what I've gathered, in 1977, he got very angry because he was a paratrooper right when democracy was restored in Brazil. So for him, he saw the end of the dictatorship as kind of the end of what he stood for.
Right.
And I think since then, he's trying to bring that back. And he's actually been a very successful politician since then. I mean, he was in the city council and then eventually did, I think, 7 terms in Congress. And he is a guy that to me is very dangerous because, like, back to the COVID stuff, is like he's become an anti-vaxxer. He's homophobic and an anti-vaxxer. I think those are like the two big takeaways of his values. He's just like a Christian fundamentalist who hates gay people, but he also hates science and vaccines almost as equal. And the fact that he was, like you said, grifting this whole process, and his officials as well were grifting this whole process is insane to me, because the reason why he was elected is because of that giant Oberrecht scandal that removed Teo and whoever the other leader was in Brazil. Like, he actually got elected because he said he would end corruption. And now during a pandemic, he's directly responsible for close to 500,000 deaths. And it's insane.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. But yeah, you make that really good point of like Putin and Bolsonaro are operating in systems that they don't want.
Yes.
and I mean, Bolsonaro just blatantly said, "Let's do away with democracy. Let's go straight to the dictatorship," and that's what you have to look out for. I mean, not everyone that participates in democracy is democratic. Not everyone sees democracy as the end goal, right? I think some political theorists see democracy as the end goal, as we want to work our political system to be more democratic, where some view it as just the ends to a means, to a different means. If I can use democracy to seize power and then get whatever, my Christian fundamentalism or my social revolution in China or whatever it is, but just use democracy to get there, like they will, and then get rid of the democracy. So we have to be careful of who we elect to positions of power, because not everyone values the institutions that they're standing on top of. Bolsonaro is an obvious example and a pretty blatant one. And like you said, yeah, I mean, he's just a fascist through and through. I mean, basically self-explanatorily.
Well, the worst thing too is that, like, it looks like his popularity is awful, considering more than half of Brazilians hate him. My issue is that it's kind of the same thing right now as the Trump 2024 question mark. Is that, like, does popularity matter when you have a small base and you're doctoring the election process to your favor? It's kind of that slow-moving coup crisis where it's like Bolsonaro has pretty much fired anyone who's against him. I mean, he's done arguably a more efficient job of Trump in doing this, maybe because Brazil was already so just chaos after the Oberrecht scandal, and people were just even worse off than Americans in terms of, like, how they viewed government. But it seems like Bolsonaro has scrapped every form of check and balance on him. And so, to me, when I see that he's maybe going to be struggling in 2022 when there's an election, I just don't know if that really matters anymore. And that's what terrifies me, is like, that's why the Firehose of Falsehood is so dangerous.
Yeah.
Is because it erodes discourse. It erodes the fact that, like, if you're not popular, you're not popular. You're not going to win.
Yeah, and back to the United States, I think, like you said, like that fire hose. Like, if we thought the fire hose was turned on for 2020, wait for 2024, because I bet you that's all it's going to be. I bet you if the Republican Party in the United States is still on its Trump train, which it very much right now is, looking at CPAC numbers, 70% of Republicans want Trump. The other 28% want DeSantis, who is Trump 2.0. So, yeah, it's on that train. And so that fire hose, they're going to pull it to full throttle. They're going to turn it on to 5. And Bolsonaro as well. I think he's going to realize that he's going to utilize that to his advantage. I think Bolsonaro is going to sow as much confusion around the election as possible, claim that his opponents or someone, isn't doing things right, maybe postpone them or just win them, whatever. But he's going to start it now, and he's going to ramp it up if his poll numbers don't change.
If I can just interject super fast, like, the other scary thing in the U.S., specifically with the Firehose of Falsehood, is the Ashley Babbitt narrative. That was that ex-military gal who was shot by police after storming the Capitol. It's tragic in a lot of ways because she resembles the misinformed, voter who thought it was her constitutional prerogative to storm the Capitol, and she was shot and killed by police storming the Capitol. And now Republicans, the narrative has changed so many times that I think a lot of Republican voters are confused on the importance of January 6th. And now there's T-shirts out there that say, who killed Ashley Babbitt? And now you've had Tucker Carlson and Trump saying she was a patriot and she was killed by the police. And she went from a dumb martyr to now an actual martyr. And just like Bolsonaro, who was stabbed and spent most of his election campaign in the hospital, now there's an Ashley Babbitt that is part of this fire hose of falsehood. So